Welcome to the third annual Brevard County PFAS meeting. If you guys are joining us, please make sure that you mute your mics when entering the room. This is a very special meeting tonight because it's wrapping up the hard work of all of our volunteers on this 3-year project. Volunteers spent their time and money going out in storms to collect samples, train, attend meetings, and educate themselves and the community on PFAS chemicals. I realize many new people are coming in, and I want to briefly explain who I am and how I got into this work, as our site has over 200,000 new visitors in this past week. 10 years ago, our military family was impacted by cancer in the most horrific way. My husband was overseas fighting a war in the United States Army when I became ill. In the same year I was diagnosed with cancer, my uncle, who was not blood related but lived with us most of our lives, my brother, father, and even the family dog were diagnosed with cancer too. We had genetic testing that showed no mutating genes, and it was documented in my medical records that my case was environmentally caused. As doctors and experts continued to ask me where I grew up, this sparked my need to get to the source of the problem. I learned through official government documents that we had some of the highest levels of PFAS chemicals in the groundwater in the nation in 2018. I grew up on Florida's Space Coast. When I was a child, I was drinking from a well. Most people don't consider the amount of PFAS chemicals we drank or our water quality in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. People I grew up with always joked about not drinking the water, but we never really understood or knew why. To this day, often locals will joke about the water quality in our area. Fight for Zero was founded by our military family alongside cancer survivors and has since grown with members who are firefighters, farmers, parents, and even youth who want to secure a healthy future for themselves. Many of our families weren't given the opportunity to protect themselves because PFAS has been a heavily guarded subject with billion-dollar industries that knew it was causing harm to the environment and human health since the 70s. We aren't trying to alarm communities. We are trying to arm them with knowledge. The first step for us is to address these concerns was working with teams of scientists and doctors with the resources, experience, and knowledge to identify communities most vulnerable to PFAS exposures in Brevard County. That's why this project was so important to the 267 people who signed up to volunteer. Other steps we have taken individually and as Fight for Zero include testifying before Congress, engaging our local representatives, collaborating with national advocates, and even working internationally to bring attention to these forever chemicals. Because of our work, the EPA lowered its PFOA and PFOS advisory levels. We helped secure cleanup funds through several avenues, helped organizations get funding for the Lagoon, and got physician guidance from the Academy of Sciences, and PFAS is now a mainstream topic. This is a time for us to come together as a community to learn and use the information we receive to ensure that polluters are held accountable for prioritizing profits over public health. With your help, we can push for transparency, laws, and cleanup and prevent other households from experiencing what so many of our families have. Thank you for joining in this live stream this evening. If you see a red dot, we are live as you are watching. We encourage you to use the comment section to ask questions and give input, as this is a community-driven effort. That being said, I want to hand this over to our first speaker, who will discuss their fish monitoring program with Orca. Missy Weiss is the Director of Citizen Science and Education at Ocean Research and Conservation Association. Thank you guys for tuning in tonight. I'll hand it over to Missy now.
Thank you, Stell. I'm honored to be here and to be able to be a part of this forum, as well as present about our citizen science project called One Health Fish Monitoring. Let me just bring up my presentation. Can you all see this screen? Yes, thank you. Okay, so ORCA, again, it stands for the Ocean Research and Conservation Association. We are a nonprofit founded in 2005. And as part of our community research, we offer the opportunity for people.
This meeting is being recorded.
We offer the opportunity for people to get involved in one of our 4 citizen science projects. And the one that I'd like to speak about today is our One Health Fish Monitoring Project. Just to let you know right off the bat, when you're asking yourself, why isn't she talking about PFAS? I thought this was a PFAS conference. I'm not going to be sharing any PFAS data with you tonight. However, my hope is, and you'll see why in a moment, that I will be able to prepare and share some of that PFAS data during next year's conference. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term One Health, this is really an integrated approach that aims to balance and optimize the health of people, so human health, animal health, and plant and animal health, and recognizing that they are closely linked and that there's an interconnectedness between them. So under that umbrella, ORCA really looks at how various pollutants, various toxins and toxicants enter into the Indian River Lagoon and those freshwater canals, and whether those pollutants are entering into fish that have been identified as being fish that are commonly consumed by people. And then we wonder whether, well, is there a potential human health risk through the consumption of these fish? So there's really 3 main objectives of this project. 1, what are the different pollutants that are entering into our waterways? 2, are those pollutants entering into our marine food web, specifically into fish, again, that are commonly consumed? And 3, what is the potential human health risk, if any, of the consumption of these fish? Understanding that this is just one exposure route that people may witness or be a part of. At this time, we started this project in 2019. We have collected over 1,100 fish from Volusia County down to Martin County, all through the help of community volunteers. So of those fish, what we currently look for is we look for 2 different biotoxins in those fish. We look for microcystin and saxitoxin. We look at 3 different heavy metals, mercury, lead, and cadmium. We look for different herbicides, such as glyphosate, that commonly chemical compound in Roundup. We look for microplastics in the fish fillet and stomachs. And then as you see bolded here, we recently sent samples, about 115 of them, to our partners at UF, who are going to be analyzing those fish tissue samples for us. So again, this is where I'm hoping that during next year's conference, we'll be able to provide that information. And then those contaminants, those pollutants that are listed at the bottom in italics, those are things that we would love to be able to add to this project. So as we build our collaborations, our partnerships, these are some of the different pollutants that we'd like to add. So this is by far one of our more popular citizen science research projects. At this time, we have over 150 active volunteers. In 2022 alone, they donated over 1,000 hours of their time. And I think, again, it's because there's numerous ways that these volunteers can get involved. One way that you can get involved is by just catching fish for us and donating those fish. And we have partner bait and tackle shops up and down the lagoon where you can drop those fish off with the information necessary to then process them. We also have volunteers who will come to our lab in Vero Beach or in some of our pop-up locations and help us process those fish. So we've got 125 people that are involved in that component. We have about 30 individuals who we then also train on the actual extraction techniques. So how do you actually remove these toxins and toxicants from the fish? And there are about 10 individuals who we have been able to train as part of our Fisher survey component of this project. So there's lots of ways that you can get involved and ways that you can be a part of this project. Now, I always like to be able to provide just a little bit of preliminary data. I think it provides some context to the comprehensiveness and thoroughness of the kind of research that we do at ORCA. And so I just wanted to be able to show you some mercury data at this time. Before I do that, I want you to look closely at this figure. This is a graph right now where we have received fish. So clearly you can see that folks in Brevard County and Indian River County have heard our call and have donated a tremendous number of fish to us. St. Lucie, not so bad. Martin County, we really want to boost that number up to be over 100. And Volusia, we only have 1 fish. So this is where we really need to use your help in the community to be able to increase that number. We've also been able to try to localize some of this pollution. So aside from looking at it by county, we also start breaking down each county by sectors. So each of these color blocks represents important regions. And so I chose Brevard County to show you an example of. And so we try to divide Brevard County into different color segments, like I said, and the blue number represents the number of fish that we have received from each of these sectors. So we're doing fairly well on the southern portion of the lagoon. We've got some empty spots here in the central. And so again, this is where we are looking for your help so that we can start really localizing that pollution by when we process our fish. These are the fish that we're targeting. So aside from looking at our contaminants regionally or spatially, we also want to look at it by species. And so again, these are fish that have been identified as being commonly consumed through our fisher surveys. So we don't want any old fish from the lagoon. We want to target those that people are saying that they are eating. So this is on our website and can be provided. So again, I wanted to just focus on mercury as it's, again, one of those contaminants that we hear a lot about, but we don't necessarily always see. So the way that we acquire our samples are that, again, volunteers donate their fish. They will then homogenize them in our lab and then aliquot those fillet samples to then be sent out to a contract lab that's measured for metals. So if we just kind of focus down here on the bottom at mercury, at this time, we have monitored or processed over 960 fish. So we have 964 fish that we have tested for mercury. If we look at it by county, what we're seeing at this time is that Martin County fish have significantly higher concentrations of mercury compared to St. Lucie, Indian River, and Brevard County fish. I do recognize that the sample sizes are different, and that's why we were really hoping to be able to get more fish from Martin County to bump that number up, but we feel confident enough to be able to share this data with you all today. Also, we find that Indian River County fish, on average, their mercury concentrations are significantly lower compared to Brevard County, St. Lucie, and Martin County. So as we increase our sample sizes, we will be able to continue sharing and updating this graph. As I mentioned, we also try to be able to localize it a little bit more. So again, here is that Brevard County sector map that I showed you a little bit ago. So at this time, we've tried to just look at those sectors that have at least 10 fish or 10 mercury points for that particular sector. We're already starting to see some differences in mercury concentration in fish from various regions of Brevard County. So again, at this time, we have BC8, this northern portion, as well as BC17, those fish have significantly higher mercury concentrations compared to the other sectors here with the brackets. So BC21, which is right here, BC24, BC4, and BC10. So again, we really like this idea of trying to go pinpoint into specific areas to be able to, again, track that source. When we start comparing our average mercury concentrations by county with advisory consumption guidelines, what we are seeing at this time is that the orange line is representing the advisory level presented by the FDOH for women of childbearing age and children. On average, the mercury concentrations of fish in Brevard, Indian River, St. Lucie, and Martin County all exceed this FDOH advisory level. When we look at the joint advisory level from the EPA, FDOH, and FDA, we find that Martin County fish meet that joint advisory level for the general population. So we are seeing some concentrations of mercury in our fish that are worth tracking and continuing to monitor. The next logical question is, well, yeah, you're kind of pooling all of your fish samples into one county, but are you seeing any differences in mercury by species? And so the answer to that is yes, we are. So this is a figure of various fish where we have at least 8 sample points per fish. And we wanted to kind of, again, try to see, well, are there different mercury concentrations between these different species? What we're seeing at this time is that bluefish, blue runner, sea trout, ladyfish, crevalle jack, and hardhead catfish have higher concentrations of mercury compared to those down here like mullet, crappie, black drum, croakers, pinfish, and sheep's head. And so when we run some statistics, we do in fact see that these higher 6 fish are significantly higher in mercury concentration compared to these lower fish. It doesn't appear to be really dictated by level of food chain or fish length. And so again, this is why we really want to kind of bump up those sample sizes. But this is definitely of interest for people, especially as they consume fish, or for those subsistence fishers that rely on this fish for their primary protein source. And again, when we compare or overlay those advisory consumption guidelines to these fish species, not all of them meet the advisory guideline for women of childbearing age and children. We do have a couple of fish species which stay below that average mercury concentration, but we certainly have some species that are showing to be above that advisory consumption guideline for the general population. Again, bluefish, blue runner, sea trout, which includes your spotted and sand sea trout, ladyfish, crevalle jack, and some hardhead catfish. So our ask to you and to the community members that are listening to this presentation is a couple of things. One, we want to be able to continue sharing our data. Every 6 months, we provide findings to date on all of our citizen science research. And so we want to be able to continue that, and we want to be able to share new and important data. So if you want to check out the findings to date that was presented last month, you can do that by accessing it on our website. But then in several months, we'll be showing hopefully our PFAS data, as well as some of our other pollutants. So ways that you can help: donate your fish. If you are from Volusia County, the Marine Discovery Center is a drop-off location. There are several in Brevard County where you can drop off your fish. If you're in Martin County, please do the same. Again, we have partner bait and tackle shops that will accept your fish. If you want to learn how to process or homogenize those fish, you are welcome to attend any of our trainings or our workshops. You can check that out on our website. We have this great fishing tournament. That's what this flyer is here, where you can win some fabulous prizes by, again, submitting your fish. Those bait and tackle shops are on this flyer here. Collect fisher surveys. So if you happen to be someone who's on this call who catches and consumes fish from the Indian River Lagoon or those freshwater canals, put your phone up on this QR code, scan it, and fill out the survey right now. So this is another way that you can, again, help us better understand what species are people eating, how much are they eating, and who are they sharing it with? Are they sharing it with their elderly parents, their pregnant wives, their children? And then last but not least, spread the word. We all know the importance of communication and disseminating information to our community and our neighbors. So if this is of interest to you, you're welcome to share away, let people know about this project. And if you have any specific questions, you are welcome to reach out to me at any time. This is my email address. I only had 20 minutes, so I wanted to go quickly, but if you do have questions, I'm happy to answer them at this time. And of course, thank you to our wonderful sponsors who, without you, we wouldn't be able to do any of this important research.
Did we have any questions for Missy to ask? Okay, if you guys, we have a hand raised. Lou, go ahead.
I just wondered if you could comment a little bit about how you localize the fish to the individual subdivided areas. How do you track that?
So basically the reason why we ended up doing that and creating that sector map is that we found that some fishers would not donate their fish because they didn't want to give away their secret honey holes. And so initially it was more about just trying to protect people's, protect them and work with them. But then it really became obvious that those sectors are specifically created because either they contain a very specific freshwater canal or freshwater lake or a very specific component of the lagoon. So there was strategy behind trying to create those sectors. And so at this point, not only is it a way to kind of allow our partners to feel comfortable donating their fish, because we ask everybody where they collect those fish from, but it also, again, allows us to say, okay, well, are we seeing fish accumulating different concentrations of pollutants in different little subsectors? Because that's important. Is it because those fish are residential and they hang out there and that's the greater amount of accumulation of those pollutants, or is there another reason? I will say we have other research projects like pollution mapping, where we're monitoring water and sediment for a whole panel of different pollutants. And so we are at the point very soon where we're going to be able to overlay that data with our fish data and be able to see if there's any relationship there as well.
We have a question on our live stream. It's on YouTube right now. Facebook is having issues, so if you guys want to head over to our YouTube, we have all those links out. We have a question regarding if you know anything about how much fish consumption they're worried about. Is there a limit that they should have, or if they should be cooking it a certain way?
That's a great question. So the challenging thing, I think, for some people is that when you try to find that information out, and even just doing a quick Google search, you'll find different information from different reliable sources. And so I will say that there are some EPA advisory consumption limits as far as how much, how often for specific species, but that isn't necessarily lagoon focused. It's cumulative across the region or the states or wherever. So you're not really seeing those values representing necessarily lagoon fish as opposed to, United States wise.
Another question that we see in the chat is, can you comment on other metals of concern? Do we see multiple contaminants of concern on top of the mercury?
Yeah, so one of the things that we really are looking forward to being able to do, and we're almost at that point, is being able to look at the cumulative impact of all of these pollutants. And so specifically to answer your question about some heavy metals, if you noticed on that slide, I had cadmium listed. So we received a small grant a couple of years ago from the IRL NEP that allowed us to look at 100 different fish species and test their fish fillet tissue for cadmium. Of those 100 fish, only 2 came back with detectable levels, and they were very, very low. So, which is a positive thing. That's a great thing. That's what we want to see across the board. And so we've discontinued monitoring for that particular heavy metal. We've seen the same thing for lead. So we monitored a subset of fish for lead. Again, we saw very, very low concentrations, not high enough to be able to warrant spending funding on monitoring more. We are seeing various levels of microcystin. And so that is something that we are going to kind of tease out a little bit more because that data is rather complex. And then we have just been able to kind of, just a quick analysis though, we were able to look at that herbicide glyphosate in about 350 or so individual fish species. And we weren't seeing any kind of significant difference across county, but we were seeing it by species. But those levels were so low that when you compared them to the ADI levels, they were not levels of human health concern at this time.
Okay, if you guys have any more questions, go ahead and put it in the chat. We're going to move on, and I want to introduce our next speaker. He has served in senior leadership roles with government, nonprofit organizations, academia, and in industry. He currently serves as a governor-appointed board member of Florida's Harmful Algal Bloom Task Force. He served 9 years as a governor-appointed member of CareerSource Florida. He is a member of the board of directors for the Florida Ocean Alliance, the Association of National Estuary Programs, the advisory board for the Southeast and Caribbean Disaster Resilience Partnership, the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association, and a legacy campaign cabinet member for the Brevard Zoo Aquarium Project. Dr. DeFries has been an avid surfer for over 50 years, and we're honored to introduce Dr. DeFries for our next presentation.
Thank you, Still. And thank you, everybody. We've got a big crowd out there, which is excellent. I'm going to take a little different approach than the last meeting we had. I'm not going to show a whole lot of PowerPoint slides, but I want to tell a story about transformation. And this is a perfect example where I want to thank University of Florida for this incredible amount of research and also Orca for the work that they're doing. We're very proud to have supported some of that Orca work from the National Estuary Program. but especially recognize Stell Bailey and our work with Fight for Zero. When you look at contaminants and toxicants in our environment, and especially our waterways, it is a long, hard road to get from contaminants that are suspected of being of concern and get them into that regulatory framework where they are contaminants of concern, and you begin to see regulatory action and mitigation action. And Stell, I just want to thank you for your hard work because what you're seeing now is the beginning, of a transformation in both our knowledge, our regulatory oversight. And I thought it would be worth spending just a few moments with you talking about where we are at that federal level, largely due to this partnership between science and scientific research and environmental advocacy. So thank you all. As I said, it's a slow start going from, a contaminant of suspect concern and getting into that framework. And so I want to share like the last 36 months of really profound changes at the EPA level nationally that we hope continues as we move forward to understand this problem and other problems with emerging contaminants. So on March 2023, I think we crossed one of those transformational boundaries when EPA announced proposed national primary drinking water regulations for 6 PFAS substances. That is a huge step forward. And by the end of this year, those regulations will go into force. But there's a lot that's happening at EPA that you don't see unless you go on the website, spend some time, and really look at the changes that have occurred within the agency. And many of you probably know, but we are part of EPA only in a non-regulatory way with the National Estuary Program. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But along with the new regulations, we're seeing some other things happening. So we're beginning to see health advisories for drinking water, something we didn't see 5 years ago. We're starting to see a foundation of research and knowledge, and the work that you're going to see here in a few minutes from University of Florida, some of that work was funded through the EPA STARS program. I think it was a little over $880,000 over that 3 years. And I'm really excited to see that work come to fruition, get into peer review publications so we can use it within the National Estuary Program. What is most exciting for many of us who've been in this game for a long time is you can talk about planning, you can talk about problems, but fixing the problems takes investment. And the investment we're seeing over the last 24 months has been nothing short of historic. And so $10 billion has been allocated through the US Congress to address emerging contaminants under the bipartisan infrastructure law. And some of you may know that as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Those dollars are going to be available for the next 5 years. The National Estuary Program is seeing some of that money, not a big amount, not in the billions, but we've got $909,800 coming through our program to increase some of the work we do. But it's really the research that's going to drive some of the questions that you all asked Missy, about, is this fish safe to eat? How much can we eat? Are there different human demographics, different species demographics? And so I guess the story for all of you is that your voice is important. Your voice to Congress, not only thanking them for the investment, but making sure that investment continues, but also making sure that investment in research continues, because we are at the very beginning of understanding the health implications of PFA and PFAS substances. And there's a lot of them, so 6 have been regulated, but there's, well over 1,000 that are out there that we don't know much about. Translating that science, though, into action is a real challenge, and it's something that I'm struggling with as we begin to prepare our 5-year update of our comprehensive conservation and management plan from the National Estuary Program. And so I just want to mention a few of the challenges that I see as we move forward from here. Engaging with the public is always challenging when you have really difficult technology and science. This is very complicated chemistry. And you'll see tonight that our 3 science people are really do a good job of making this simple to understand. But while regulatory oversight is increased, the task to regulate is daunting. And so if you look for PFAS compounds in products, it's not just fire, retardant foams, but every sofa, every carpet, every drape, napkins, paper straws, those chemicals have been used within manufacturing on a global scale. And even if we regulate here in the United States through EPA regulation and begin to kind of address moving this entire chemical group out of manufacturing, you still have all this international product coming into the United States that may not be regulated in those countries. So that's going to be a challenge, is decreasing kind of the potential exposure, in that supply chain. The other really big challenge is now that it's in our environment and you can pick up PFAS compounds in Antarctic and Arctic ice, it's a global problem. How do you mitigate the hotspots? What are the technologies for soil remediation, for water remediation? How best do you prioritize those challenges? And while, when you talk about billions of dollars, I can tell you in the remediation side of this, that's not a lot of money when you start thinking about every airport, every military base, just identifying where to mediate and then what technologies to use. And I know UF is working on some really innovation technologies in that regard. But those two are really important challenges. And I want to just give you a sense as I finish up where I think the National Estuary Program can function based on our authority and our non-regulatory status. So I'm going to try to share my screen right here. Can you give me screen share? I'm disabled right at the moment. Okay, let's not worry about this one graphic. I'll describe it and you close your eyes and you can imagine it. So when we restructured back in 2015, we identified 32 vital signs for the Indian River Lagoon that encompassed 3 broad areas. Water quality was one, habitats were one, and we looked at communities, and then we looked at some of the, the direct aspects of what we do as a program. Contaminants was one of those vital signs. And to be honest, other than mercury, a lot of the contaminants that we mentioned in our 2019 document when we adopted, like glyphosate, like PFO and PFAS, we just didn't have enough information to provide recommendations other than we need to continue to do research. I suspect that will be a continuing issue on our update as well. We are, as you saw earlier, funding small projects with our modest amount of money. And so we've got 5 RFPs literally active right at the moment. It's not billions of dollars, but it's almost $1 million. Water quality restoration, habitat restoration, community-based restoration, and science and innovation. So those of you who are in the game of doing work, I encourage you to take a look. You can go to RFP 1 Lagoon. It'll take you right to the site. These are going to be RFPs that are open for quite some time. So January would be the closure. I also want to at least mention the tremendous effort that's happening at the state level. And so during the last legislative session, for the first time since 1990, an act was passed called the Indian River Lagoon Protection Program, which allocated $100 million this year alone to Indian River Lagoon water quality and restoration. That portal for grants being administered by DEP is now closed, but stay tuned. The governor in his executive order back in January was requesting 4 years at $100 million every year. And so that will be an issue in the upcoming legislative session, to continue appropriations for that. And then lastly, I just want to say thank you. We can't do this work. So the National Estuary Program, we don't have regulatory authority. We don't have taxing authority. We operate based on revenues that come to us through EPA, through 5 counties, 2 water management districts, and DEP. We try to leverage those dollars the very best we can. And you saw with Orca, 2 projects that are not huge in the amount of grant funding, but are huge in the amount of knowledge and information that a small amount of really well-applied funding can deliver. So those of you who are interested in chasing grants, feel free to call us. We provide free grant writing support for any program or that you want to go get funding for, and you may not have the capacity to do grant writing. Obviously, you can't use our grant writers to go after our own grants, but if you want to chase new EPA funding or DEP funding, you need support. We're here to assist with 3 professional grant writers that are on continuing contract. And then again, thank you to UCF. Thank you to all the players, Orca, Missy. This doesn't happen unless we work together. And PFOA, PFAS, that is going to be a problem that we'll be working on for the next decade and beyond. So with that, I'm going to just turn it back over to you, Stell, and answer any questions.
Are there any questions for Dr. DeFries? We are on our YouTube right now looking through the chat. We also have a chat on the Zoom. I do have a question, Lou.
Yeah, I just wondered if somebody could comment about where we stand with respect to other countries in understanding and approaching this problem.
I'll jump in, and I think probably some of the UF folks probably have a comment on that. So it depends on what direction you look, Lou. So if you look at Europe, Australia, there are a number of countries that are ahead of us in looking at toxicants and contaminants and also regulatory oversight. But if you go to other countries, Indonesia, many of our 3rd world countries, some countries that have, intensive industrial manufacturing, there's probably very little concern about some of these contaminants. So it depends on where you look.
I'm just going to look through our tab to see if anyone else has their hand up or has any questions that are on the Zoom right now. If you guys have any additional questions, put them in the comments and we'll definitely send them your way, Dr. DeFries. And thank you so much for coming on and explaining some of the most complicated parts of this as far as regulatory. And we've been up in DC, we've been pushing on a federal level, trying to get money in the NDAA. And so we're with you on that. Thank you so much.
Let me jump in and just let everybody know, some organizations mine being one that just simply can't lobby. We're federally funded. But do not underestimate the power of going to Congress in Washington, D.C., making appointments in those offices, and talking to our elected officials and their staff. And this goes for Tallahassee too. This doesn't work well in a distance. Face to face is where it happens. So those of you who can, should be having these clean water conversations with our elected officials at every level, local, state, and federal.
I agree. I think that's a great segue to our next speaker, who is Dr. Leah Stuckel. She is a research associate professor of toxicology at the Center of Environmental and Human Toxicology at the University of Florida. For 18 years, she has been providing technical support in toxicology and risk assessment to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, Miami-Dade County, and the Florida Department of Health. Dr. Stuckel currently serves as the director of the Risk Assessment Corps, which helps determine the soil, groundwater, surface water, and sediment cleanup standards for the state. Welcome, Dr. Stuckel. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, are you seeing the presentation correctly?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. I was asked to come here today and talk to you a little bit about the screening levels for PFAS and what they are about and kind of what they mean. So let me see if I can, there we go. One of the questions that a lot of people ask is, how do scientists use this community acquired data? So I know that people are donating fish to the project, and I've heard there's been some surface water data and other data. You look at PFAS and what do we do with it? Well, we can do a lot of things with it, which you've seen in some of the other talks today. But one of the things that I do with it is I compare it to screening levels to determine if it's protective of human health. So what are screening levels? Well, screening levels are an amount of chemical that you can have in an environmental medium, which is water or soil or fish, that you could be exposed to every single day of your life, and you would not be expected to have any adverse effects from it. It's also known as like a no effect level. How do we calculate these screening levels? Well, if we decide that we want to have a safe level, a level that tells us whether or not we have too much of the chemical in either the soil or the water, then we have to derive a value that gives us a safe concentration. And how we usually do that is we look at that safe concentration, which we can get from human exposures. They can be either accidental workplace exposures, or in the case of PFAS, we have exposures everywhere because it's unfortunately in our food and in our water. Or we can have some animal data that tells us what a safe concentration would be. Then we use average human body weights or upper end water consumptions and calculate the level we would need to meet that screening level. So it would be a tap water concentration that you could be exposed to every day of your life and not have any effects. To get tap water, one of the things that's most important, or two of the things that are most important, are our body weight and our water consumption. So we want to do this with adults and children because we have different body weights in adults and children, and even infants, they have much smaller body weights. And to be protective of those infants, we're going to have the smaller body weights and the water consumptions that they have. For soil, we have something very similar, but instead of just ingestion, we have inhalation and dermal exposures too. So for inhalation exposures, that's going to be in the dust, right? If you're out in the soil and the dust gets kicked up, you're going to inhale it. Dermal can be when particles get on you or when you actually make contact with the soil, but ingestion is going to be the incidental ingestion. It's not actually eating the soil. It's when we get some soil on our hand and then hand-mouth behaviors like smoking, or for children, putting toys in their mouth or going inside and eating a sandwich without washing their hands, that's going to get some of the PFAS into their body. In addition to the body weight, for soil, we also need a frequency and a duration of exposure. We assume water is something that you're going to take in every single day of your life. So for tap water, we assume 365 days a year for a lifetime. But for soil, we need to know how often you're at a place and for how long. So for a residence, we assume you're at your residence every day. But other places, such as workplaces, schools, parks, we can have different frequencies and durations that allow those numbers to be higher. So you might notice that soil screening levels are dependent on what we call the receptor, whether it's a child that's of concern, or a resident, adult, a worker, a recreational person at a park. And it's also the scenario involved. In other words, are we worried about the dirt? Are we worried about the fish? Are we worried about the water? And these different screening levels doesn't mean that we don't agree on what's going on. It's just saying that there are different numbers for different people and different exposures that all lead to the same amount of chemical getting in our body. And remember, this is a chemical concentration that's getting in our body that we know would not have any adverse effects on us. So what are these screening levels for PFAS? When the screening levels for PFAS for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection were derived, it was in 2019. So that's 4 years ago now. And as you know, the discoveries on all the toxicity that's going on with PFAS has grown, and it's grown especially in the last couple of years. So these data probably need to be reevaluated. But when they were reevaluated originally, what we looked at was the levels that at that time they believed would not have any effect on people if it was seen every day of their life. We use those equations, and for PFOA and PFAS, because their safe levels were considered to be the same, they had the same soil screening levels. We have a resident of 1.3 milligram per kilogram and a worker of 25 milligram per kilogram in soil. The surface water screening levels were also based on human health, and that was due to fish consumption. And the PFOA and PFAS levels here are different because they accumulate in fish at different levels. PFAS is lower in the water, 0.01 microgram per liter, because it was seen to accumulate more readily into fish and therefore be at higher concentrations of fish. Again, at the time this was done, this was in 2019, there were not a lot of data on fish and accumulation in fish. And that's why some of these studies are so important, because we're finding out so much more information. And when we put these levels out there, we can make screening levels that we know are keeping up with the science and what we know about PFAS. So how do we use the screening levels? Whoops, I'm sorry. I'm having trouble advancing here. Sorry. Okay, so how do we use them? Well, in not just having them as just numbers that we compare the soil to or we compare the water to, they can also tell us where the risk is coming from. Is it the ingestion pathway that has the highest concentrations, or the dermal, or the inhalation? And that allows us to target that risk and manage it. If we know it's the inhalation of particles that is causing the most risk, that allows us to do things like maybe put some grass down. Ground cover can stop dust from coming up. It allows us to water the ground to keep dust from coming up. And it can also be remediated. The soil can be removed and clean soil put on top so that when dust is generated, it's clean dust, clean dirt that's going through the air. This also helps us set the fish advisories. And with fish advisories, if the numbers in the surface water were really low, as you saw, and usually we do have levels because these chemicals are ubiquitous, they're found in all the water bodies. We do have levels a lot of times in the water that are higher than these. So we can use these to say, well, the water concentration is a little higher, but if you eat 6 ounces of fish at a sitting, you can have 1 meal a week and still be at a safe level, or 2 meals a week, or 1 meal a month. And that might be something that you see coming from the Department of Health. And the Florida Department of Health will set out fish advisories for how many meals per week you can eat based on different chemicals and based on different water bodies around the state. It also helps us set exposure guidelines for unusual exposures. I kind of made a mention to it. We do have those provisional levels in soil for residents and for workers, but we can also make them for parks, for gardens, for schools. We just take into account the people that are going to be there and their frequency and duration of exposure. And that kind of goes into a community-specific risk assessment. Because if you remember on the second slide, when I showed you these math equations that told us what we put in to get these safe screening levels out, we're using national average body weights, we're using upper end screening levels for water. So when we think about water consumption, we do use larger numbers than average. We try to use what they call a 95th percentile, which means that 95% of the population drinks that much water or less. So we're protecting a large amount of the population by doing that. But again, it's on a national level. And by doing a community-specific risk assessment, we can use data right from your community to be able to know what that risk is. Now, when I say community, the community can be defined as a geographical area. It can be defined as something very small, like a neighborhood, or an entire county, or even like the Atlantic coast of Florida. Community can also be an occupation. We've done risk assessment for fish boat captains who do commercial fishing and bring in the fish. We found that they eat a lot more fish than the average person. And it can also be age groups. This is very important for some chemicals, which may affect children more than it affects adults. And instead of calculating these general risk levels, we'll be able to calculate a screening level that is specific to your community and would be protective of the ages, the body weights, and the fish consumption levels in that community. I also get asked a lot about individual risk. Like, what is my individual risk? These are the drinking water numbers. These are the soil numbers. What's my risk? Well, with a screening level, that's the level we know is safe. We know that at that level or below, no adverse effects will occur. But if you're above that screening level, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see an adverse effect or that you're going to get sick, right? It just means that we're above the level we know to be safe, and we need to do some more investigation to figure out if this is going to be a problem and if we need to remediate it. So if we're above that risk, it doesn't necessarily mean an individual might see some effects. And whether a specific individual gets sick or not, we don't know, because we're all different. So imagine if you're in a meeting room, if we're all sitting down in a meeting room at a big table and someone comes in and they have a cold and they're coughing and they're sneezing. And when the meeting is over, we all get up and leave. We don't know who in that room may get sick. Could be everybody, it could be nobody. It might be dependent on how close you were sitting to the person that was sick, whether you sanitize your hands in the area you were sitting. And it may also be based on your immune system, whether you were already sick or whether you're susceptible to illness. And the same is true with environmental exposure to chemicals. For PFAS and other chemicals, when it's in the body, it can do damage. So getting it out of the body and getting out of the body quickly is important. And we all have different rates of metabolism and excretion. which is the elimination rate of the chemical. So how fast your body can break this chemical down or make it water soluble and get it out of the body is going to determine how long you're exposed and whether this chemical is going to be able to do damage or not. We also have different compensatory mechanisms for damage. And that's just a way of saying that when we get hurt inside, our body heals itself. If something goes wrong on a cellular level, our body is equipped and ready to heal it, make it better. But eventually, when we're exposed to chemicals that do enough damage, our body can't overcome the amount of damage that's being done to it. And you start to see an effect. You may start to see an illness or an adverse effect from it. And how much you can heal and how fast you can heal does vary between individuals. Finally, the different amount of baseline function. We know that PFAS affects the immune system, and we know that people's immune systems vary. So if you're immunodeficient, or you have a regular immune system, or if you have this great immune system, you're one of those people that's like, I never get sick. That will also make a difference. Because if PFAS is going to do something to the immune system and make things maybe a little more susceptible to letting other bacteria or something get in your body, then if you already have a really good immune system, maybe losing a little bit of that protection won't matter. But if you're immunodeficient, losing any of that protection could be a big problem. So while we can do these risk assessments on a community level, we can do them on a Florida state level, and we can do them on a national level, it is very difficult to know everyone's individual risk. And we try to deal with this by using upper end exposures and protecting everyone by using numbers that we think are going to represent the population, right? And these community levels we know have extra protection built in them, and the screening levels will be levels that will not cause an effect if you are at that level or lower. I know this was a little confusing. It's a little different probably than what you've heard before. I really appreciate your attention. If you have any questions or you want to talk about this more offline, I've put my email address and my work phone number up for you to contact me. Thank you guys so much.
There was a question on one of our platforms. By the way, we fixed our meeting chat, so everyone should be able to go to the chat now, and it's easier for me to see in there if anyone has a question. But in the meantime, somebody asked if you could speak more on vaccines and how PFAS exposures can impact that.
Well, right now, I'm sure as all of you know, our knowledge on PFAS has been changing greatly over the years. I'd say in the past 5 years, we went from thinking that it affected liver to that the most sensitive effect was developmental effects, and now we know it's the immune system. So this may not be the end of the story for PFAS. There may be more, but as of right now, we think it's the immune system. And this is based on a study of the Faroese Island children. And they found that 5 to 7-year-olds who were vaccinated with their normal childhood vaccines, their diphtheria, tetanus, measles, mumps, rubella, all those, they're more likely to have breakthroughs or get these illnesses with the PFAS in their system. So the breakthroughs positively correlated with the concentration of PFAS. The higher the concentration, the more likely that they had a breakthrough of the vaccine. And that is pretty much what we know about it right now, is that it is affecting the way that our body builds antibodies and immune response. And there are probably people out there that could talk a little more detail about that, but that's pretty much as far as I know.
We do have quite a bit of questions on blood testing. Is there anything people want to know if they can get their blood tested? Especially, we have a lot of firefighters tuning in tonight, and they're very interested in that.
Yes. I'm not sure where you can get your blood tested. I know you can. I know they can get that for you. I do know that is very important in firefighters because they do tend to have a little bit higher PFAS concentration than the rest of the US. But what's important to remember is almost everyone, probably 98% of the people in the United States, will come up with PFAS in their blood. That it's not something where, oh, I have PFAS in my blood, there's a problem. Almost everyone will have it. So there is also the question of, just because you have it, you need to know what the national average is and whether you're above it or below it. And at that point, we kind of go, well, this may not be the safest thing in the world to have it in your blood, but you live in the US, so there's nothing we can do about it. But if you're higher than that, then maybe we want to reduce your exposure to that.
And that was going to be the next question. Somebody said, how do we combat that being in our blood? Basically, how do we reduce our exposures?
Reduce exposures. It's really hard in today's society because it's in our furniture, it's in our clothes, it's in our food and in our water. The best things to do would be to, if you feel that the water consumption is usually, for most people, one of the largest intakes of PFAS. So you can use the charcoal filters or the reverse osmosis and remove PFAS from the water. There's also food. We know that PFAS is used in a lot of the grease-resistant packaging. So, for example, popcorn bags, those microwave popcorn bags, the butter doesn't soak through, the oil doesn't soak through because there's PFAS in there. And those are now the shorter chain PFAS. But again, they said, well, the shorter chain PFAS, they're safe. And now we're finding out they're not as safe as they used to be.
Another one from a firefighter. They're very concerned about their turnout gear, and they're wondering what kind of exposures they should be worried about as far as dermal contact, skin.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're learning about that right now. I don't know if there's another option. I know right now they do not have anything that is going to be water resistant, oil resistant, heat resistant, like these PFAS, to protect firefighters. And that's our most important job right now, is to make sure that you're safe when you go to fight that fire. But there are those ideas that, well, I'm being exposed to PFAS and I'm putting my health in danger for this, especially when you get near the heat. I know that some PFAS tend to break down and can cause problems. So, I think after exposure to the turnout gear, washing the turnout gear with laundry detergent, washing yourself with soap, any kind of surfactants to get it off is probably the best we can do. And I think that if the firefighters nationally could push to get us a way to have something, another chemical besides PFAS, and have it tested before we put it in the turnout gear so that it doesn't turn out to be worse. But have something else. I think there really needs to be a push nationally to do this.
Another frequently asked question that we get all the time that's also coming through this chat box is concerning the difference between, like, a lot of people wonder about, well, what about, like, MIMS, for instance, just found out they had some PFAS in their drinking water. Could you explain to them that they're worried about taking a shower versus drinking it? Can you kind of just go into that, like their exposures on that side of things?
What we know about PFAS so far is that the exposure of concern is going to be ingestion. If you're eating it in your food, if you're drinking it, there's not very much in the air. From what we know, there's not a lot of studies on that. The few studies they have doing it around open burn pits and stuff, it falls out pretty quickly. It doesn't stay in the air. And the dermal exposure also, for the shower, what's washing off with the water, you're using soap, it's going to come off. It's not something like with the firefighter turnout gear where it's on your skin and your skin is occluded for a while. But I think that these are possible things in the future we might find are issues, but so far everything that's coming out is showing that it's safe to take a shower in these types of water, and it's PFAS contaminated water.
I think that's all we have for tonight. If you guys have any more questions, though, please put them in the chat. Feel free to email us. We'll make sure that we get them to the team. Thank you so much for your presentation tonight. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. DeLise. She earned her bachelor's and let me see here. Sorry, I'm reading off of a. Okay, she's with the University of Florida. Dr. DeLise, are you there?
Yes, I'm
She
here.
works in environmental engineering sciences and started her academic career at UF in the fall of 2017 after working 4 years in environmental consulting as a project and QA manager. Her research in environmental biotechnology focuses on fate transport and remediation of pollutants and pathogens. Additional research interests include resilience, sustainability, and public health. Your research areas are water systems, ecology, and ecological engineering, and I'm going to pass it to you.
Okay, I'm gonna start sharing, and I'm like always, I'm gonna need, wait, let me see if I can. Do you see my slides now? Or are you seeing the note speaker slide?
I see your slide.
Okay,
The
perfect.
community
Perfect.
resilience.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that you're seeing the whole screen, otherwise you're seeing like a tiny screen. Perfect.
I don't see the, yeah.
You don't see it, John?
It's
I'm-
the presenter mode.
Oh,
have to,
exactly. So you're seeing
You have to
this.
display, you have to swap the displays.
Yeah, exactly.
It should be up top.
Stop here. I'll swap displays. There you go. There. Are you seeing now the full screen?
Looks good.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Okay, thank you. Really exciting to see everyone's presentation today, and it kind of really guides into our project update. So as you know, this is our 3rd year annual conference for our EPA project. And building community resilience to PFAS exposure. This is an EPA project that we got granted in 2020. We're on the 3rd year of the project, but because we started in the middle of the pandemic, it's taking us a little bit longer to complete all the tasks. EPA has allowed us to extend a year to complete all the tasks of the project. So we're going to present quite a bit of data today. But we'll still more to present in the coming year. Another thing that I want to say, some of the data that we're presenting today has been already peer reviewed and published. And if you can mute, but some of the data is still in preparation to submit to manuscripts. So I have put notes in some of the slides that actually say unpublished data, do not use or replicate. We just want to make sure that the data goes out once it's been published. We want to protect our students' work and our work as well. But we feel like it's important to share these with the community. So I just wanted to let that know ahead of time. So, oops, why can I not skip here? Let me move it here. Okay, perfect. So we're going to be going over, I know that we all know what PFAS are, but I still want to go a little bit and give a little bit of a background, because just as a refresher, so that way as we're discussing the data, we kind of tie in a little bit to that. We're going to go over the goal and objectives of the project again, and then provide the project update and data. That's where I'm going to spend most of the time, and then we're going to allow some time for questions. So PFAS, right? So PFAS are a large group of man-made chemicals that, and they vary widely depending on their chemical and physical properties, as well as their potential for risk, right? Like Leah just recently discussed. These have been in the environment since the early 1940s, introduced into consumer products, but it wasn't until the 1990s that we realized that, there are toxic effects. And it's until recent times that we've started developing, learning a little bit more about the impacts in the environment, the impacts to public health, and that we've started to develop technologies to try to deal with these issues as well. So there's different kinds of PFAS, right? So there's PFAS, there's a family of compounds. There's over 9,000 of them in the global market. We don't really know how many they are because some of these are, since they're man-made, it's proprietary information. So we don't have all that information at hand, but we know there's over 9,000 in the global market. Within this family of PFAS, there's classes of them, polymers and non-polymers. For the purpose of these research, we're going to be focusing on the non-polymer ones, right? Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, because this is up to date. These are the substances that are most commonly detected in humans, in biota, and other environmental media, and appear to be most abundant in like the sites that we're investigating. So the focus of our presentation and our study is going to be in these two, right? And perfluoroalkyl substances and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So PFAS, I'm just putting two examples, right? So PFOA and PFOS are two compounds that are like the most widely studied and talked about. They are perfluorinated compounds, meaning that all of their carbons are tied to these fluorine, which makes them more like a terminal PFAS. So they're not that easy to break down. If there was a hydrogen here somewhere, then they will probably be able to, partially degrade or break down in that conjunction, but these are harder to degrade. So these PFAS have your functional group, which is hydrophilic, and your fluorocarbon tail, right, which is hydrophobic. And what that means is that it allows PFAS to live pretty much in the interface on the environment. So you're going to find them in the surface of water, into water and air, or into the soil and air. But then when PFAS are in high concentrations in the environment, like let's say water environments, they can start, their hydrophobic tails can start to like tend to attract to each other, and they start forming these micelles. Or they can create bilayers within the soil, or like the hemicell formation as well. And this is important because this type of behavior can actually increase potential for bioaccumulation, either in the water, because it will be in the water column now, or for those organisms that are bottom feeders, or plants growing in that segment. So PFAS can come from many places, right? We know that they're everywhere: manufacturing sites, landfills, any place that use PFAS in foam, like airports or military facilities, firefighting training facilities. And these can continue to be transported through the environment until they reach wastewater treatment facility plants, or drinking water facility plants, because we're extracting water from the environment, and then just keep getting recycled. And that's kind of how it reaches to us, either just direct deposition of these pollutants into soil, or through runoff or injection of wastewaters into the environment. I don't know why this one is kind of like the text kind of moved a little bit, so I apologize for that. So PFAS are in everything, right? In the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey has detected them in about 97% of Americans. As discussed before, it's been linked to several types of cancers. There's a lot of research as well related to cardiovascular diseases as it relates to PFAS, decreased immune response, increased risk of thyroid, and it can also affect, infants' development. But what about PFAS replacement? So we don't know much about that, right? So a lot of the research, and the reason I'm bringing this up is like a lot of this research is primarily based on these PFOA and PFOS, a little bit with other type of PFAS as well. But there's not a lot of toxicological studies that can be kind of linked to potential health outcomes in humans for these other array of pollutants that are there. Again, there's like over 9,000 of them. We're testing for just like 100 of them, and most of the research is just being done with these like less than a handful of PFAS. So the goal of our study, the overall goal of the project, is to increase resilience in our vulnerable coastal communities in Florida, increase the resilience to PFAS exposure. But to improve that resilience, we first need to identify risks and vulnerabilities of the community. So we have to focus on identifying areas that have a higher diversity and concentrations of PFAS, and communities that are at higher risk of exposure because of their proximity to these contaminated sites or because of their practices, right? So these are the objectives of the project. Today, we're just going to go over some of these because, as I mentioned earlier, we haven't really completed the project yet, but we're going to go over our baseline, right? We first needed to establish a baseline of diversity and concentrations of PFAS in different environmental media, the soil, water, sediments, fish, and then assessing like what would be the impact is once there's an extreme event, right? Once there's a flood, once there's an extreme event, does that change significantly the concentration of PFAS in the environment, or it's just kind of follows a similar pattern like to that, you know, seasonality that and changes that PFAS typically have. And then identifying potential PFAS exposure pathways and the population vulnerability based on like our data. We're still going to be working, and additional research is currently being done to assess like what is the partition of PFAS between soil and water or sediment and water under changing conditions. We're going to present a little bit of information on that, but it's field data. It's not experimental data with control conditions. So that's still pending. And further objectives we're going to be covering in our next meeting as well. So last time we have a meeting, I think we have about like 300 samples that we've collected with support of the community. As of now, we have over 600 samples, and this is just for Brevard. We have a lot of projects that are ancillary projects to this, and we've extended sample collections across across the state of Florida. So this is specific just to Brevard. So a lot of granular data in Brevard, more so than other areas of the state. We have baseline surface data, discrete water samples, and this baseline surface water data, what it means, like, and for those of you that volunteer, like, you will know exactly what it is. So we selected specific sites across the county, and we were monitoring at a specific frequency throughout the year. So we have a seasonality, right? We have in that same location concentrations of PFAS throughout the year. And then the discrete surface samples, it just means that we went and we collected sample at one time, this one-time event. And it's just to kind of be able to grasp a little bit more cover area in the lagoon and potentially identify areas that we might want to incorporate and include in further studies or into the baseline study as well. We've also collected stormwater samples. This is also being done with support from the community. We have foam samples, sediment, soils. Our sediments and fish samples have been collected with a lot of support from like Orca. Some of the samples they kind of gave to us for the projects, and others are part of their project that we're analyzing, and some of it we're going to be presenting today. So this is just presenting how, like, you know, our process. We have standard methods in place for extraction of PFAS from different environment. And these figures just pretty much shows like how we go through it. There's specific way of like doing solid phase extraction where we're just conditioning these cartridges, we're adding our sample, and then the PFAS are collected within the membrane. And then we just add another solvent to elute just the PFAS, right? We kind of clear it from anything else. And then at the end, we just collect the PFAS. And that's what we're going to be putting into the instrument for analysis. That's pretty much, it's a very laborious intensive work. So my student might be mad that I'm just making it so simple. It takes days, but this is kind of the short gist of it. So in surface water, this is a summary of the surface water for the Indian River Lagoon primarily. So overall, our study shows PFAS are everywhere within the lagoon. They're diverse, they're in high concentrations, and we also observe like spatiotemporal patterns of PFAS distribution across the Indian River Lagoon. So we detected about 19 PFAS, but we were able to quantify about 15. Those were the ones that meet our quality control standards. The range of like the sum of PFAS per site range between 11 and over 1,500 parts per trillion. PFOA was one that was detected in all the samples all the time. And then these other species, like these other compounds, were detected at over 90% of the time, including PFOS. So what we see here is like we divided the samples by region just to see if there was regions within the Indian River Lagoon that consistently had higher concentrations of PFAS than others. And we can see that so Banana River, right, in this area here, had consistently higher, it has a higher mean and consistently higher concentrations. And the central Indian River Lagoon is more like in this area here. So it also had higher concentrations kind of south of that Banana River. Mosquito Lagoon had the lowest concentrations, and then North Indian River is just there. So lower than North Indian River, then the central, and then Banana River, where Cape Canaveral and Patrick River base, all of these area here had the higher concentrations of PFAS. So I mentioned that we observed like a seasonal behavior in PFAS diversity and concentration. So we see, and this is based on our baseline samples, right? So we combined them by region. Although there were specific sites, we combined the samples by region, and we clumped all the data like by seasons, so it would be easier to see in the graph. And we see that the behavior, like for in the North Indian River Lagoon, had higher PFAS during the summer months. Like these will be more like this slide. So the North Indian River, which is this here, will have higher concentrations during the summer months. That's the green. Banana River had higher sum of PFAS during fall. And then the Central Indian River had higher PFAS during winter. So this is Central Indian River, and this is higher concentrations of PFAS during winter. So the lagoon doesn't behave like a river. It's not like the water, right, in the lagoon does not move from like a head water to a mouth like a river. Our baseline study actually suggests that some movement of PFAS is happening north to south, and we need to look more into this. But you can see that as seasons progresses, and you see like an increase too, and it might be like kind of a build up of PFAS moving into a certain area, or it might just be specific. It might just be due to specific things happening there in that site, and it's not mixing. So we need to look a little bit more into that, but this is what the data is suggesting right now. When we look, so we know that there's PFAS in the water. We were able to quantify about 15 of them. When we look into sediments, we're looking at both higher concentrations and higher diversity of PFAS in sediments than in water. So most of these samples were collected by ORCA. So we have samples in the North and Central Indian River Lagoon, and then we have these others collected more like South Indian River Lagoon. I want to note that don't try to compare these exactly as they are, because these have different concentrations, right? So we have total PFAS in sediment that are going like in the thousands of ppt, while surface water is just under 100 ppt. So again, sediment, about a total of 25 PFAS were quantified. The majority of them were long chain. And then surface water, about 13 PFAS were detected, and this is a combined study, so it's just the sediment and the column water was collected at the same time. And then for surface water, the majority of the PFAS were short chain. So we're seeing that there's an accumulation primarily of long chain PFAS into sediment, and then majority of the short chain PFAS are remaining in the water column. And then so we see that the sum of PFAS, in sediments is from 2 times to 147 times more than what we see in the water. So higher accumulation of those in the sediment. So recall that our work is embedded in like community resilience to pollutant exposure after extreme events, right? That's kind of like the focus of the study. We know the baseline concentration of PFAS throughout different seasons now, and we know that, you know, there are higher concentrations on sediments as well, but then we want to know if the role of a storm event in actually transporting these PFAS from contaminated sites to the lagoon or to the communities. So we've established a network of trained volunteers and clear standard operating procedures and videos. And then we have for sample collection and for data reporting, right? Sample kits are delivered to them, and then and the volunteers will have it on a standby basis so that they're ready to collect samples when a storm comes. And then, you know, for those of you that have experience working on disaster resilience, you understand the value of crowdsourcing of sample collection, because many times we wouldn't have access to these locations otherwise. So the work of the community has been pivotal for us to get this data. So again, we mentioned, like, we have collected samples for these different systems for like about 6 different weather events. We have data for one. All the other data is actually being processed at the moment, and it will be ready in a couple of months from now. But I wanted to at least show this one. So we're convinced that the time and the frequency of sample collection is crucial to understand the transport of PFAS during storm events. So while data is suggesting here that there is some dilution in some of them. So if you look at Titusville, this will be before, during, and after. So you would say that during the storm event, when water is flushing in, there's a reduction. So we're seeing kind of like a dilution effect there. But this is not the same for these other sites, like near Cape Canaveral and Cocoa Beach and Merritt Island, or so it's not the same. It's not the same pattern. So while some of these sites suggest a dilution in some areas after the storm event, those are in close proximity to known source sites of PFAS, we see a spike. So that said, the temporal variability, meaning like how these concentrations are changing over time during the storm, is too high. It's just too quickly. So these data is crucial for us, but we understand that we have to actually move forward, perhaps with establishing. So these data in particular allows us to identify which locations we want to focus on for further studies. And we know that we want to focus on areas that have in close proximity to known or suspected source sites, see what's happening. And the plan will be to establish like an auto sampler that allows us to collect samples at a higher frequency throughout the event without having to have volunteers kind of going back and forth during the storm and collecting samples. Another work that a lot of you have been collaborating with Dr. Bowden is related to PFAS and sea foam. So sea foam is not PFAS, right? Sea foam forms when dissolved organic matter in the ocean is kind of agitated and it churns up. But we've observed that because PFAS like to be in those interfaces, right, of air-water interfaces. During this process, PFAS tend to accumulate in that foam. So sea foam is sea foam, but if there's PFAS in there, the PFAS will be accumulating in that sea foam. So we have samples of 140 sites throughout the US, a majority of them in Florida. These are both from coastal and riverbank foam and water. So samples were collected of foam and water. The range of PFAS in the foam, for single PFAS in the foam, it ranged from 5 to 50 parts per billion. This is like 1,000 times like more we're thinking of water, so more concentrated than it is in water. When we're talking about water, we were talking of parts per trillion. This is parts per billion, so larger concentrations in foam that we see in water. And then the highest sum of PFAS in foam was 97 ppb, and this is like about, so what we saw is that the foam had between 30 and 1,000 times more PFAS than the water that was along with it. So definitely it's concentrating in the foam. So since we're seeing an increase in the concentration of PFAS in certain areas after storm events, and with this formation of foams that can reach out, right, the coast as well, we want to identify areas with in land, right, with high concentrations of PFAS that can represent primary sources of PFAS to the environment in the moment of a flood. So we know that there's a spike in the water, so the spike has to be coming from runoff. So we want to see what are the concentrations of PFAS in the soil. And we did a preliminary study for this. So we have samples, many samples for Brevard. I'm going to start talking about this initial study that we did. And it was selecting 3 different types of soils. So we collected about 12 samples and around Titusville, Cocoa, Melbourne, and Valkyria, and then south of Patrick Air Force Base. This was our first study, and we selected sites that represented either background sites, so there were community parks or areas that have been capped with soil, just like Dr. Suckle mentioned earlier, like just clean soil put on top. So we're not expecting, you know, it's maybe there was contaminated soil under, but the cap soil should be clean, and we're not expecting it to have PFAS. And then we also collected near primary source sites, and which will be our military sites or manufacturing facilities, and then secondary source sites, which are those areas that might receive runoff from primary source sites, or that are sprayed with, irrigated with reclaimed water that could be contaminated. It's similar to water extraction. We have standard operating procedures in place to analyze and quantify PFAS in soil. Overall, the samples are air dried, and then they're sieved, and then there's a specific process that we have to do several times to extract all the PFAS from the soil before we reduce that concentrate and concentrate those PFAS, and then put them in the instrument for analysis. So what we see in this initial study with these 12 samples is that there is actually a significant difference between the background sites and those sites that were in close proximity to primary source sites and the secondary source sites. But there's not, in terms of concentration, it's not that strong, but there is some difference, but it is not significantly different from that, from those secondary source sites. And then when you looked at the diversity of them, so out of the 29 PFAS that we were able to quantify, and this is out of like the 92 that we're looking at, so we were able to identify 29 of them. We can see that between primary source sites and secondary source sites, while primary source sites have slightly higher diversity and concentration, it's not that much different. The highest concentration of PFOA and PFOS did not exceed the provisional soil cleanup target levels established by EPA. Again, it's ppb, right, are concentrations, again, higher than what we were seeing in water, which is PPT concentrations. So we're seeing higher concentrations in soil and water, but they're still not exceeding the target levels that FDP, like these screening levels that FDP established that are in ppm concentration, parts per million. So after seeing those results, we wanted to kind of expand our study into different areas within Brevard County. So we have over about 80 samples or so that we collected that are represented here. And what we did is like we divided the samples based on like soil type or what we were looking for. Like we were aiming for areas where communities use and that we anticipate not to be too contaminated, in areas that we anticipate that might have some contamination. So we selected boat ramps, these are in red here, community parks, these are all areas for recreational activities. So community park is blue, industrial, commercial, and military is green. And then residential is the purple ones, and then Superfund are yellow. And when you look at these initially, it pretty much, my first, I guess my gut reaction, it was like, I don't like it, right? Because there doesn't seem to be that much of a difference between like an industrial and military side compared to like a community park or a residential area, right? So these box plots are showing kind of like the mean, and then kind of like the distribution of the median, and then the distribution of the samples around that. And while there's like areas that have high concentrations within, you know, the military and commercial sites, we also see really high concentrations in community parks. So the range, 22 PFAS were quantified in this additional extended study, and they range between non-detected and like 10,000, like over 10,000 ppt concentration. The highest PFAS concentration found was actually at a community park, like for a single PFAS, not for the sum of PFAS, but the higher concentration was, and it was for PFOS, and it was like over 5,000 ppt. But overall, highest concentration of like PFAS diversity and concentrations were higher at industrial commercial sites, just slightly higher than other sites, and then it was lower at the boat ramps. Eric, do you want to take over these sites?
Sure, I
Dr.
can talk
Eric
about
Coker
this.
is part of our team, and he's an environmental epidemiologist, and he's in charge of doing our vulnerability profile. So he's gonna go over these slides. Thanks.
Sure, thank you, Kathy. I mean, I'm not going to be able to have time to get into the nitty-gritty details of what led to these pretty plots here, but just to talk about, you know, the intent here is to identify where we see kind of cumulative or combined indicators of vulnerability in terms, not just exposure, potential exposure to PFAS, but also, you know, demographics of the population, access to adequate housing, you know, the socioeconomic status of communities. These gets to like how resilient are communities, can they adapt to storms, can they adapt to pollution in their environment. That's what these indicators are trying to get at. None of them are perfect, but and then we also look at the presence of potential sources of PFAS in the environment. And so you can see this plot on the left is a heat map, and this is all data for Brevard County. And so we use a combination of US Census data, site location information, and we kind of combine all that information, and we can do this cluster analysis to say, okay, which communities have similar vulnerability profiles. And you can see on the left side of this heat map, there's all these indicators, these variables that we use in the cluster analysis that Kathy's just kind of indicating there. And we find in general across Brevard County, there's 5 groupings of profiles based on these variables. And I suppose the take-home message from this is cluster 4, which appears to be the most vulnerable profile based on kind of high levels of kind of populations we might think that are more susceptible, such as younger children, high levels of unemployment, high prevalence of minority populations who kind of are marginalized in a lot of political discourse. In addition, lower socioeconomic status, lower high school education achievement, lower income, higher poverty. That's all really kind of clustered in cluster 4. It's concentrated in that cluster. And they also have some of the highest prevalence of contamination, potential contamination sources, as well as the highest levels of average PFAS in soil detected in the study. So cluster 4 is indicated in the bright red, not the dark red. So cluster 5 is also vulnerable in terms of having a lot of sources of chemical contaminants. But cluster 4 really would be the one we would say this appears to be the most vulnerable communities based on these suite of indicators that we've analyzed. And so what we've tried to do with this map on the right is to highlight where those communities are. They face elevated levels of PFAS compared to other communities. Not saying that these are elevated levels in the sense that they need to be cleaned up per se. I'm not trying to argue that. It's just that within Brevard County, this is where we see the elevated levels. And then we do assess flood risk in this cluster analysis, and you'll see that clusters 3, 4, and 5 have the highest levels of flood risk. And incidentally, the places that have the highest levels of PFAS in soil also have the highest flood risk. So unclear if there's a correlation is not causation here, but there does seem to be something going on there that this analysis is merely saying these are the communities we believe that probably require greater attention when it comes to mitigation, when it comes to preparations for flooding, when it comes to preparations for storms, and that are likely to have greater impacts when we think about PFAS moving around an environment and when flooding happens. So these are the results. I don't have too much time to unpack them, but you can see the communities. I've tried to highlight them, at least label them, Cape Canaveral, Cocoa, Titusville, communities, some communities in Melbourne. So hopefully you get a sense and have to answer questions about this. Can we go to the next slide, Kathy? So I know a lot of this is focused on Brevard, but we do have community partners in Jacksonville as well. And the reason why we included Jacksonville here is because it's also a coastal community, also has a military installation that has had measured high levels. I think it actually has the highest levels of PFAS, some of the highest levels detected in drinking water at the military installations. So we felt it interesting to have another site to at least maybe not directly compare with, but see if we see similar patterns. But the project in Jacksonville involved working with high school students, where we trained them in environmental health literacy and conducting the soil and water sampling. And one thing that the students expressed interest in was understanding the role of redlining and whether or not there's differences in PFAS and in community parks in redlined communities versus non-redlined communities. And so the map for those that don't know what redlining refers to is back in the 1930s, as a part of the New Deal, there was this homeowners loan corporation, and briefly just to explain what it did was it designated communities as hazardous, and it just so happens that those communities designated as hazardous were also predominantly Black communities. It ended so the D grade neighborhoods are those redlined communities. The C grade communities are what was at the time called in decline, and essentially what that ostensibly what that was is they were becoming more populated with Black people, and so this redlining scheme was kind of solidifying racial segregation in American communities. And so that's what this map on the left is depicting, the redlining patterns for Jacksonville. And so what the students did, they went into various community parks throughout Jacksonville. There's 12 sampling sites kind of indicated in those points. And then, they collected the soil samples, sent them to the lab at UF. And the students waited for a long time for those results, and we finally have those results for them now. But all that is to say is that we do see spatial differences in PFAS contamination. The map is trying to depict that. In fact, we are seeing kind of higher levels in Jacksonville, I would say, than what we see in Brevard, and unclear what is driving that. And these are our community parks. So if I showed you box plots similar to what Kathy was saying, those would be shifted upward. So can we go to the next slide?
Yes.
So just to quickly wrap up here, so that on the x-axis for both of these bar plots is the HOLC grades. So the redlined communities are the D grade communities, and the declining communities are the C grade, and then the predominantly white communities are the A and B communities. And so what we see in these results is when we look at kind of median or mean PFAS levels, the levels seem to be higher in the C communities, not so much in the D communities. But when we look at the absolute maximum values detected in these community parks, that's when we see a large difference between the graded communities, where the D grade communities, or the redlined communities, the graphic on the right, or the bottom, excuse me, is showing you where we see the elevated maximum concentrations that occurred in the D grade communities. So a lot more analyses need to be taken place here. The limitation here is there's only 12 sampling sites, so that pales in comparison to what was done in Brevard. So this all needs to be taken with that grain of salt. But needless to say, there does appear some kind of inequalities going on at community parks with regards to high levels of PFAS, but obviously much more sampling would need to be done to kind of substantiate these results. But so the students plan on reporting these results back to stakeholders. So that's all I've got for you today. Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, this is great. Thanks. So in addition to, that was a follow-up of our soil samples, because our vulnerability assessments were performed with concentrations from our soil samples. We've also gathered some information, and we've also worked on PFAS bioaccumulation in aquatic systems. So we've worked with seagrass was one of these. The process for analysis of seagrass is very similar to soil, just with a prior step to dry them and grind them before we move forward to extracting in a very similar manner that we did soil samples. It's not okay. Wait. There. So this work has been published already. So, and this is the publication by one of Dr. Bowden's grad students. She graduated already. So samples were collected in different areas of Florida: the Indian Lagoon, Indian River Lagoon, the Tampa Bay, Florida Bay, Charlotte Bay. Also, there were samples collected in other areas, but just for the purpose of the presentation, I'm only working with this. So PFAS were detected in all aquatic vegetation samples in all locations. About a total of 12 PFAS were identified in this aquatic vegetation. And then the sum of the PFAS among all samples at all sampling locations range between like 4.35 plus minus almost 5 ppb. Again, higher concentrations, much higher concentrations than in the water. So we can see that there's an accumulation. And then if you look at the sum of PFAS in the Indian River Lagoon, compare with Tampa Bay and with the Florida Bay and the Charlotte Bay, you can see that, Indian River Lagoon has areas with a lot higher concentrations than in other areas of Florida. just for this particular comparison. Dr. Bodin has another student that is also working on bioaccumulation of PFAS in sharks. The study is being performed, like the samples were collected in the southeast section of the US. And then about like 4 different species of shark were processed. So blood sample of 4 different species were collected and assessed. And then there's a pattern that suggests that, you know, specific species have higher concentration than others. And these most certainly has to do with like their behavior and like, you know, like their bottom feeders versus like what type of eating habits they have. Primary PFAS that were detected were like long chain PFAS in this fish. So we have a lot of fish samples, as I mentioned at the beginning, provided through Orca. We still are in the process of going through those, but I would anticipate like that, you know, these fish samples from sharks will provide a little bit of an insight of what we should expect in terms of like PFAS concentrations based on like behavior and habitat and eating habits. There's also PFAS data that we've collected from households. Another of like Dr. Bodin's students has been working on drinking water samples. About 468 drinking water samples were collected throughout the state. We have about 27 samples from Brevard. The mean, this is not minimum or maximum, the mean sum of PFAS in each of these samples was about 6.2 parts per trillion, and out of the 27 samples, one of them exceeded the current 4 ppt standards for PFAS. There's also been a study, this is actually published already as well, and this study was performed using HVAC filters. So HVAC filters from household and UF facilities were analyzed for PFAS. About 27 PFAS were measured in at least one filtered, but the predominant species were polyfluorinated dealkylated phosphate esters, or the DPAPs here. So these are not specific PFAS. These are just kind of like groups, right? So PFCA is very common, but then both in household and campus facilities, the higher concentrations were found for DPAPs, and these represented about 95% of the whole sample in campus facilities and about 98% in our household facilities. So again, this is what is being collected from our HVAC filters through our household dust that is like kind of being filtered through the system. There's not a lot of information that I could find about health outcomes related to these particular PFAS. So again, it's just kind of an insight that these are the PFAS that were commonly found in the environments that we're interacting with. So there's really a need for more information on like what are the potential impacts for exposure. There's also a study performed in pools. There was not a significant difference between the concentration or diversity of PFAS in like pools that are from like personal use versus a hotel or like the public pools. But the highest quantified sum of PFAS was detected in a pool in Melbourne, Florida. This is also a already published study, so you can access and see additional details from it. So ongoing work, continue to work on our analysis for fish that we're working with Orca. We are in the process of developing studies like these batch sorption-desorption studies are going to allow us to understand how changes in the environment, you know, we know that PFAS are in the soil, we know PFAS are in sediments, but if the organic matter, because of a runoff or a discharge area, like changes a pH or changes the temperature, or changes the salinity, like how could that impact PFAS in that area? Like, how would it help it either mobilize more, become more bioaccumulative, or like just bind into the soil, stay in the water column? So we're trying to understand a little bit better so that we can better predict how PFAS will move under some of these events. And then we're using all this data and incorporating all this data into creating like a model that can be used to assess community resilience to PFAS. And so that's what we're going to be working in the next year, and then just finalizing some of these data so that we can publish and share like complete details of it. I wanted to thank our extended group here at UF. There's a lot of students working in here. Huge thanks to Saneri Santiago. She's a primary PhD student working on the project, the one that analyzed the majority of the samples presented here and prepare all the beautiful graphs and maps as well. But all the students help immensely. As I said, this is a very laborious kind of work, so a lot of people needed to do it. And this is our team here at the University of Florida. So if you have any questions, this is how you can reach to us. In addition to the team at UF, we've been in communication, like, with ORCA and Department of Environmental Protection and our community partners. So everybody helping a little bit. So if you have any questions, just you can reach out to me, or you can reach out to any of our partners. So if you have any questions now, I'm ready. Thanks.